Korvaxian dreadnought, Eternal Dominion, hung in space like a monument to conquest, its crystalline hull catching starlight and fracturing it into rainbow warnings. For 3 millennia, the Korvax had swept across the galaxy, their psychic might and energy manipulation abilities making resistance not just futile, but laughable. They had crushed the silicon-based Netheri with thoughts alone, turned the proud warrior clans of Vesperon into willing servants, and watched entire civilizations kneel before their mere presence. Commander Velthorn stood on the observation deck, his luminescent blue skin pulsing with contained power. At 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and eyes that burned like miniature stars, he embodied everything that made the Korvax the galaxy's apex predators. His telepathic awareness stretched across light years, monitoring the final preparations for their latest conquest, a small blue world in an unremarkable system called Sol. The reconnaissance data confirms it. Commander reported his 8 Quilax, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked her as a senior psychic operative. They call themselves humans. Bipedal, no apparent psychic abilities, primitive, technology barely capable of escaping their own gravity well. Population approximately 8 billion. Veltharn's mandibles clicked in what passed for Korvaxian amusement. 8 billion minds to add to our collective. Their thoughts will strengthen the great network. He gestured, with one of his lower arms, toward the blue marble, growing larger in their viewports. Begin standard subjugation protocols. Disable their communication networks. Establish psychic dominance zones around their major population centers. This should take no more than a solar cycle. The Eternal Dominion descended through Earth's atmosphere like a falling star made of malice. Conventional Korvaxian doctrine was simple. Appear over the target world's largest cities. Project overwhelming. Psychic force to paralyze resistance. Then begin the mental integration process. It had worked on every world they'd encountered. The ship materialized over New York City at dawn, its 2-kilometer length casting shadows across Manhattan. Velthorn extended his consciousness, preparing to blanket the city in the crushing weight of Korvaxian mental dominance. The psychic wave rolled out, like a tsunami of pure will, designed to render every human within a 100-kilometer radius catatonic with fear and submission. Then, something impossible happened. The wave struck the human minds below and ... scattered. Not absorbed, not deflected, but scattered like light through a prism. 8 million human thoughts blazed back at him in chaotic harmony. Each one different. Each one burning with something the Korvax had never encountered in 3,000 years of conquest. Velthorn staggered, his forearms clutching his head as feedback tore through his neural pathways. Around him, his crew writhed in agony as their carefully ordered thoughts were invaded by something alien and terrible. Hope mixed with desperation, love tangled with rage, dreams bleeding into nightmares, and underneath it all, a stubborn, illogical refusal to surrender. Impossible, Quilax gasped, golden blood trickling from her sensory organs. They have no psychic training, no mental disciplines. How are they resisting? Below them, the city wasn't falling into the expected paralysis. Instead, emergency sirens wailed, military jets screamed overhead, and millions of humans were doing the most human thing possible, adapting. Radio broadcasts crackled with urgent voices, social media exploded with first-hand accounts, and within minutes, the entire planet knew they were no longer alone in the universe. But more than that, they knew they were under attack, and humans, Velthorn was beginning to realize, had very specific ideas about what to do with attackers. The first nuclear missile struck the Eternal Dominion's shields 12 minutes after their arrival. The explosion painted the morning sky in atomic fire, and while the ship's defenses held, something in that primal display of violence sent a chill through the Korvaxian commander's crystalline bones. These weren't the broken prey species he was used to. These were something else entirely, as reports flooded in from other major cities: Moscow, Beijing, London, Tokyo, all telling the same story of impossible human resistance. Velthrin began to understand that the Korvax had just encountered their first real challenge in 3 millennia. The strongest civilization in the galaxy had met humanity. Nothing would ever be the same. Dr. Kalina Rourke had been analyzing xenobiology for 15 years, but she'd never expected her subjects to come to her. The emergency command center beneath NORAD buzzed with activity as humanity's greatest minds worked to understand their new visitors. The Korvaxian ships hung over Earth's major cities like storm clouds, their presence a constant reminder that humanity's comfortable isolation was over. "The energy readings are off the charts," reported Dr. Mikhail Petros, his fingers dancing across holographic displays. "They're not just using advanced technology, they're manipulating matter at the quantum level with what appears to be directed consciousness." Kalina studied the neural scans they'd managed to capture during the aliens' first psychic assault. The patterns were unlike anything in terrestrial biology. But there was something else, something that made her pulse quicken with excitement rather than fear. "They're not gods," she announced to the room. "They're not even close. Look at these synaptic patterns. They're incredibly sophisticated, but they're also incredibly rigid. Their thoughts move in predetermined channels, like water flowing through carved stone." General Almada Okafor, the dark-skinned Nigerian woman who'd been placed in charge of Earth's defense, leaned over the console. "Explain it in terms a soldier can understand, Doctor." There, like a master chess player who's never played any other game. Incredibly skilled, but completely unprepared for someone who might flip the board over and start playing checkers instead. Kalina pulled up a comparison chart. Human neural patterns are chaotic, unpredictable. We don't just think, we feel, we dream, we contradict ourselves. Our thoughts are less like rivers and more like ... like storms. The implications were staggering. For 3,000 years, the Korvax had conquered species whose minds worked in logical, predictable patterns. They'd never encountered the beautiful chaos of human consciousness, the way a single human could hold contradictory thoughts, could be terrified and brave simultaneously, could make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Meanwhile, across the planet, humanity was doing what it did best: learning, adapting, and preparing for war. In workshops from Detroit to Seoul, engineers reverse-engineered energy signatures from the alien ships. In laboratories from Cambridge to Mumbai, biologists analyzed the few tissue samples they'd recovered from damaged Korvaxian fighters. In military academies from Annapolis to Sandhurst, strategists developed new doctrines for fighting an enemy that could read minds. But it was in the suburbs and cities, in the homes and schools and coffee shops, that humanity's real weapon was being forged. Because while the Korvax had psychic powers beyond imagination, they had never learned to fight an enemy that could adapt not just its technology, but its very way of thinking. Captain Lysander Voss, a former Special Forces operator turned civilian contractor, stood before a group of volunteers in an abandoned warehouse in Detroit. His scarred face bore the marks of a dozen conflicts, but his eyes held something the Korvax had never seen in their conquered species: determination mixed with barely controlled fury. "They can read our minds," he told the assembled group. "Fine. Then we'll learn to think differently. We'll compartmentalize. We'll misdirect. We'll feed them false information. They want to know our plans. We'll give them 100 plans, all contradictory, all equally convincing." The training that followed was unlike anything in human history. Meditation techniques borrowed from Buddhist monks were combined with military deception doctrines. Actors taught soldiers how to project false emotions. Poets and artists worked with psychologists to develop mental camouflage that could fool even telepathic probes. Within weeks, the first results began to show. Korvaxian reconnaissance teams, confident in their psychic superiority, walked into ambushes that shouldn't have been possible. Their ability to read human intentions was compromised by humans who had learned to think in multiple layers, their surface thoughts hiding deeper strategies. But the real shock came when humanity went on the offensive. The asteroid belt mining Station Prosperity had been humanity's furthest outpost before the invasion. Now, its crew of 300 miners, engineers, and support staff found themselves behind enemy lines as Korvaxian forces established a forward base on Ceres Commander Jelena Busk, a former submarine captain who'd traded naval warfare for the depths of space, stood in the station's command center, watching the alien ships patrol their territory. Her crew looked to her with the kind of trust that only comes from surviving impossible situations together. "They think we're just clever animals," she said quietly. "Time to show them what clever animals can do." The attack came not from space, but from within. Humans, it turned out, were very good at hiding. The Korvaxian High Command had ruled from the crystalline moon of Nexus Prime for over 3 millennia, their psychic network linking every conquered world in a web of mental control. The great amphitheater at the moon's heart had witnessed the subjugation of 1,000 species, the celebration of victories that had seemed as inevitable as the rising of stars. Today, for the first time in their recorded history, the atmosphere was one of confusion and growing alarm. Supreme Archon Vel, eldest of the Korvax and architect of their galactic empire, stood at the center of the amphitheater. His crystalline form towered over the assembled commanders, but the usual radiance of his psychic presence was dimmed by something none of them had experienced in millennia: uncertainty. "The human resistance continues to strengthen," reported War Conductor Nexilith, her harmonics carrying undertones of disbelief. "They have somehow learned to mask their intentions, to project false thoughts while concealing true ones. Our psychic reconnaissance has become unreliable." Valdris extended his consciousness across the network, feeling the confusion of his commanders. Throughout the galaxy, the humans had been resisting for 3 Earth months now, and instead of weakening, they were becoming more dangerous. Ships that should have been helpless against Korvaxian technology were inflicting casualties. Installations that should have fallen in days were still holding out. "How many species have we conquered?" Valdris asked, his mental voice carrying the weight of millennia. 1,437 confirmed subspecies across 812 worlds, Nexilith replied immediately. "And how many required more than a single solar cycle to fully subjugate?" The silence that followed was telling. In 3,000 years of expansion, the Korvax had never encountered serious resistance. Every species they'd found had followed predictable patterns: initial shock, futile resistance, gradual acceptance, and finally integration into the collective consciousness. Humans were different. They weren't just resisting, they were learning, adapting, and most disturbingly, they were beginning to understand Korvaxian weaknesses. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came from the Outer Rim, where human forces had begun striking at Korvaxian supply lines. These attacks should have been impossible. The Korvax could sense human thoughts from light years away, making ambushes impractical. But somehow, human strike teams were appearing where they shouldn't be, hitting targets that couldn't possibly have been known to them. Captain Zara Oduya floated in the zero gravity of her modified asteroid mining ship, watching the Korvaxian supply convoy approach through the dust clouds of the Kuiper Belt. Her crew of 12 were all volunteers, former miners and engineers who'd signed up for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. "Remember," she whispered into her calm, "think about home. Think about anything except what we're about to do." The technique had been developed by Dr. Rourke's team, used the very strength of human emotional complexity against their enemies, while the surface of their minds focused on memories of Earth, childhood, loved ones. The deeper tactical parts of their consciousness remained hidden, protected by layers of genuine feeling. The Corvaxian patrol ships swept past, their psychic scans finding nothing but homesick humans, thinking about blue skies and familiar faces. They never detected the magnetic mines being quietly attached to their hulls, never sensed the carefully planned ambush that would deprive three-star systems of vital supplies. But the real revelation came when humanity made first contact with the Corvax's other subjects. The breakthrough happened almost by accident. Dr. Rourke had been studying captured Corvaxian communication devices when she noticed something odd. Background patterns that didn't match standard Corvaxian psychic signatures. Further analysis revealed they weren't Corvaxian at all. They were the suppressed thoughts of conquered species, still present in the network, but forced into harmonic alignment with their masters. My God, she breathed, staring at the readings. They're all still there. Every species they've conquered. Their minds are still intact underneath the control. The implications were staggering. The Corvaxian Empire wasn't just built on conquest, it was built on continuous mental domination. Remove that domination, and 3,000 years of suppressed civilizations might reassert themselves. The first test came in the Andorian system, where human saboteurs managed to disable a Corvaxian psychic relay station for exactly 17 minutes. The native Andorians, a species that had been conquered 800 years ago, remembered who they were. The rebellion that followed was swift and brutal. Andorian workers across 3 worlds simultaneously turned on their Corvaxian overseers, guided by race memories of freedom and fueled by 8 centuries of suppressed rage. The Corvax managed to restore control, but the damage was done. For the first time in their history, they had to deal with the possibility that their subjects might rise up, back on Earth. General Okafor studied the reports with growing excitement. They're not just our enemies, she realized. They're prison guards, and we might just have found the key to every cell in the galaxy. But the Corvax were adapting to the first human prisoners taken by their forces, revealed something that sent shockwaves through the galactic consciousness. Humans weren't just resistant to psychic control, they were immune to it. No amount of mental force could break a human mind that didn't want to be broken. Supreme Archon Valdris felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 millennia. Fear. Not for his own safety, but for the entire structure of Corvaxian civilization. They had built their empire on an assumption that had never been tested, that any sufficiently advanced consciousness could be controlled. Humans were proving that assumption wrong. The war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Corvax, accustomed to swift psychic conquests, found themselves locked in a grinding conflict that stretched across multiple star systems. Humanity, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperate creativity of a species that had spent its entire history learning to survive against impossible odds. Commander Lysander Voss stood in the command center of the repurposed asteroid mining station Defiance, watching tactical displays that showed the current state of the conflict. Red dots represented Corvaxian forces, blue dots showed human positions, and a growing number of green dots marked the locations of liberated worlds where the Corvax had lost psychic control. Status report, he called to his operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Ria Castellanos, a former naval intelligence analyst who'd proven to have an intuitive understanding of alien psychology. Good news and bad news, sir. The good news is we've successfully disrupted Corvaxian control over 17 systems. The Vesperon warrior clans have declared independence and are actively fighting alongside us. The Nethari have rebuilt their silicon-based civilization and are sharing their quantum computing techniques with our engineers. Voss nodded grimly. The alliance of liberated species was humanity's greatest strategic advantage. Every world freed from Corvaxian control became a potential ally, and many of these civilizations had technologies that complemented human innovations. And the bad news? The Corvax are adapting faster than we anticipated. They've started using automated systems to reduce their reliance on psychic control. Worse, they've begun systematically destroying any world they can't maintain control over. We're looking at xenocide on a galactic scale. The holographic display shifted to show the Kepler 442 system, where the Korvax had recently discovered human-backed resistance movements among the native population. Rather than fight to maintain control, they had simply sterilized the entire system, turning 3 inhabited worlds into radioactive wastelands. They're willing to destroy everything rather than lose it, Castellanos continued. Our intelligence suggests they're preparing for a final push toward Earth. If they can't control us, they'll eliminate us. Voss studied the tactical situation, with the cold calculation of a man who'd spent his life in impossible situations. The math was simple. Humanity had maybe 6 months before the Korvax gathered enough force to break through their defenses and reach Earth. They needed a game changer, something that would shift the balance of power decisively. That game changer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kalina Rourke had been working with a team of quantum physicists and xenobiologists to understand the fundamental nature of Korvaxian psychic abilities. What they discovered changed everything. They're not using psychic powers at all, she announced to the emergency council session. They're using quantum entanglement on a macroscopic scale. Their consciousness exists partially in higher dimensional space, which gives them the ability to influence matter and energy at the quantum level. General Okafor leaned forward. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning they're not telepaths, they're quantum computers. And, like any computer system, they have vulnerabilities. Rourke pulled up a complex diagram showing the mathematical relationships underlying Korvaxian consciousness. Their entire civilization is built on quantum coherence. Disrupt that coherence, and you don't just block their abilities, you potentially destabilize their entire consciousness. The implications were staggering. If humanity could develop quantum interference technology, they could potentially neutralize the Korvax's greatest advantage. But time was running out. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the largest Korvaxian fleet in history was assembling. Supreme Archon Valdris had made the decision that would define the future of Galactic civilization. Humanity would be exterminated, and any species that had allied with them would share their fate. The Eternal Dominion had been joined by over 300 other Korvaxian capital ships, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. But more than that, they carried something that hadn't been seen since the earliest days of Korvaxian expansion, the direct presence of the Archons themselves. For 3,000 years, the highest levels of Korvaxian leadership had remained safely on Nexus Prime, directing their empire through the psychic network. Now, driven by the threat that humanity represented, they were taking direct command of their forces. The assembled fleet represented more than military might. It was the entire leadership structure of the Korvaxian Empire, concentrated in one location. If something happened to this fleet, the consequences would reverberate across the galaxy for millennia. Captain Zara Oduya, now commanding a small fleet of modified human vessels, studied the intelligence reports with growing awe and terror. The Korvax weren't just sending a fleet, they were betting their entire civilization on destroying humanity. They're scared, she realized, sharing her thoughts with her senior staff. For the first time in 3,000 years, they're actually afraid of losing. That's why they're risking everything. Her tactical officer, a former asteroid belt miner named Dex Crenshaw, nodded slowly. Fear makes people desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. But it also made them dangerous. The approaching Korvaxian fleet had enough firepower to reduce Earth to constituent atoms, and they were clearly prepared to use it. The question was whether humanity could complete their quantum interference project before the Korvax arrived, and if they could, whether they would have the courage to use a weapon that might destroy not just their enemies, but potentially every Korvaxian consciousness in the galaxy. The ethical implications were staggering. The Korvax had conquered and enslaved hundreds of species. But they were still sentient beings. Using the quantum disruptor would be genocide on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history. But the alternative was the extinction of humanity and every species that had allied with them. The clock was ticking, and the strongest civilization in the galaxy was about to discover what happened when humanity was backed into a corner with no choice but to fight. The quantum interference array hung in space like a crystalline spiderweb. Its components spread across the asteroid belt in a formation that would have been impossible for any single species to construct. But humanity had something the had never possessed, the ability to inspire genuine cooperation among different civilizations. Dr. Kalina Rourke floated in the zero gravity of the control station, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that displayed the mathematical poetry of quantum mechanics. Around her, beings from a dozen different species worked together with the desperate efficiency of people who knew they were making history. Synchronization at 97%, reported her Netheri colleague, crystalline, its silicon-based form refracting the light from the displays into rainbow patterns. The Vesperan warriors have completed the installation of the power cores. All systems are approaching optimal parameters. Rourke nodded, her mind still struggling to process the magnitude of what they were attempting. The quantum interference array was more than a weapon, it was a key that could unlock the chains binding every enslaved consciousness in the galaxy. But it was also potentially the most destructive device ever created, capable of unraveling the quantum coherence that kept Korvaxian minds stable. The ethical weight of their decision pressed down on her like a physical force. Use the array, and they might free hundreds of species from millennia of mental slavery. But they would also be committing genocide against their captors. Incoming transmission from General Okafor, announced her communications officer. The holographic image of the general appeared, her face showing the strain of coordinating humanity's defense. Behind her, the tactical displays showed the relentless approach of the Korvaxian fleet. Dr. Rourke, I need your honest assessment. How long until the array is ready? 47 hours, General. But we need to discuss the ethical implications, Doctor. With respect, we'll have time for ethics after we survive. The Korvax fleet will reach Earth in 63 hours. If we don't stop them, there won't be anyone left to debate the morality of our choices. Rourke understood the mathematics of survival, as well as anyone. Still, the weight of their decision gnawed at her. They were about to cross a line that humanity had never crossed before, not just killing their enemies, but potentially erasing their very existence from the universe. The Korvaxian fleet was a sight that would have inspired awe in any civilization. 312 capital ships moved through space in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls creating a constellation of artificial stars. At their center, the Eternal Dominion had been joined by the personal vessels of the Supreme Archon and the other members of the High Command. Supreme Archon Valdris stood in the Great Command Chamber, his consciousness expanded across the entire fleet. For the first time in 3 millennia, he was directly commanding military forces in battle, and the sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Human resistance has been stronger than projected, reported War Conductor Nexilith. They have somehow managed to disrupt our psychic control over 17 systems. The rebellion is spreading faster than we can contain it. Valdris felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The Korvaxian Empire had been built on the assumption that any sufficiently advanced consciousness could be controlled. Humans had shattered that assumption, and now the entire structure of their civilization was at risk. Begin the final phase, he commanded. Humanity will be exterminated, and every species that has allied with them will share their fate. The network must be preserved, even if it means reducing half the galaxy to ash. The order rippled through the psychic network, carrying with it the full authority of the Supreme Archon. Across the galaxy, Korvaxian forces began implementing what they called the Final Protocol. the systematic destruction of any world that showed signs of resistance. But the Korvax had made a crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed that the threat came from humanity alone, failing to understand that humans were catalysts, the spark that ignited the suppressed rage of 1,000 conquered species. The rebellion that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. On world after world, enslaved populations rose up against their Korvaxian overlords. The psychic network that had been the Korvax's greatest strength became a liability as the chaos of revolution spread from system to system. Captain Zara Oduya watched the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. The Korvax were fighting a war on 1,000 fronts, their forces stretched to the breaking point. But they still had enough firepower to destroy Earth, and they were clearly prepared to use it. Status on the quantum array. She asked her communications officer. Dr. Rourke reports, they're ahead of schedule. The array should be ready in 36 hours. Oduya nodded, but her expression remained grim. They were cutting it close, perhaps too close. The Korvaxian fleet would be in weapons range of Earth in 48 hours. And if the array wasn't ready, humanity's homeworld would be reduced to cosmic dust. But there was something else, a possibility that she'd been considering ever since. The intelligence reports confirmed that the entire Korvaxian leadership was with the fleet. If the quantum array worked as designed, it wouldn't just disrupt Korvaxian psychic abilities, it would potentially destroy every Korvaxian consciousness in range. Get me a secure channel to General Okafor, she ordered. The conversation that followed would be remembered as one of the most consequential in human history. Two women, separated by vast distances, but united by the weight of their responsibility, discussed the future of galactic civilization. The array has a maximum effective range of 12 light-years, Oduya explained. If we can lure the Korvaxian fleet into optimal position, we can potentially eliminate their entire leadership structure in a single activation. Okafor's image was silent for a long moment. You're talking about decapitating their entire civilization. Without their leadership, the Korvaxian Empire would collapse completely. Yes, but it would also mean the deaths of every Korvaxian in the fleet. We're talking about the potential extinction of their entire species. The weight of the decision hung between them like a physical presence. Humanity had the power to end the war decisively, but the cost would be the complete destruction of their enemies. It was a choice that would define the moral character of their species for millennia to come. How long do we have to decide? Okafor asked. 36 hours, Oduya replied. After that, the array will be ready, and the Korvaxian fleet will be in position. We'll have one chance to use it, and we'll have to live with the consequences forever. The strongest civilization in the galaxy was about to learn what humanity did when faced with an impossible choice. The answer would reshape the future of every species in the known universe. In the final hours before the convergence, the galaxy held its breath. The Korvaxian fleet, the largest military force ever assembled, bore down on Earth with the inevitability of a cosmic avalanche. The quantum interference array, humanity's desperate gambit, hung ready in the void, like a loaded gun, pointed at the heart of galactic civilization. Dr. Kalina Rourke stood in the control center, her hands trembling as she made the final calibrations. Around her, the representatives of a dozen species worked in tense silence, each understanding that the next few hours would determine whether their civilizations would survive to see another dawn. Final systems check complete, announced Crystalline Thought ascending. All quantum resonance frequencies are synchronized. The array is ready for activation. Rourke closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 billion years of evolution pressing down on her shoulders. The device before her could rewrite the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. But the question that haunted her wasn't whether it would work, it was whether they had the right to use it. Incoming transmission from the Korvaxian fleet, her communications officer reported. The holographic image that appeared was unlike anything they had seen before. Supreme Archon Valdris, the architect of the Corvaxian Empire, stood in what appeared to be a vast crystalline chamber, his form radiating power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Humans," he began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions humanity was only beginning to understand. "You have shown remarkable resilience, but your resistance ends now. We offer you one final opportunity. Surrender unconditionally, and we will grant your species a place in the Great Network. Continue to resist, and your world will be reduced to constituent atoms." General Okafor's response was immediate and uncompromising. "We've heard your offer before, Archon. Our answer remains the same. Humanity chooses freedom, even if it means death." Valdris's form seemed to pulse with contained energy. "Then you have chosen extinction. In 3 hours, your world will cease to exist, and with it, the chaos you have brought to our ordered galaxy." The transmission ended, leaving the control center in heavy silence. 3 hours. That was all the time they had left, but in those final moments, something unexpected happened. The quantum array, designed to disrupt Corvaxian consciousness, began picking up something else, something that changed everything. Dr. Rourke, called her chief technician, were detecting massive quantum fluctuations from the Corvaxian fleet. It's not just their weapons systems, it's their entire consciousness network. They're afraid. Rourke studied the readings with growing amazement. The Corvaxian psychic network, which had seemed so monolithic and powerful, was revealed to be something else entirely, a prison of mutual dependence, where individual consciousness had been subsumed into a collective that none of them could escape. "My God," she whispered, "they're not conquerors, they're victims. Their entire civilization is trapped in a feedback loop of collective consciousness. They can't stop conquering because they've forgotten how to exist as individuals." The revelation was staggering. For 3,000 years, the Corvax had been driven not by malice or ambition, but by a fundamental flaw in their own evolution. They had achieved collective consciousness, but in doing so, they had lost the ability to exist as separate beings. Every conquest was an attempt to silence the chaos of individual thought that threatened to tear their collective mind apart. Humanity's resistance hadn't just threatened their empire, it had threatened their very existence as a species. "We can't use the array," Rourke announced to the shocked silence of the control room. "If we disrupt their quantum coherence, we won't just be killing them, we'll be murdering an entire species that never had a choice in what they became." "Dr. Rourke," General Okafor's voice cut through the chamber, "they're going to destroy Earth in less than 3 hours. If you have an alternative, I need to hear it now." Rourke looked at the quantum array, then at the readings, showing the approaching Corvaxian fleet. Slowly, a smile began to spread across her face, not the smile of someone who had found a weapon, but the smile of someone who had found a cure. "We don't use the array to destroy them," she said. "We use it to free them." The modification took 2 hours and 37 minutes. Instead of disrupting Corvaxian quantum coherence, the array was recalibrated to stabilize individual consciousness within their collective network. It was the most delicate operation in human history, performed under conditions that would have been impossible for any single species. But humanity had never been about doing the possible. As the Corvaxian fleet entered weapons range of Earth, Rourke activated the quantum interference array. The wave that pulsed out from the device wasn't one of destruction, but of liberation, a carrier signal that allowed individual Corvaxian consciousness to exist within their collective network without being absorbed by it. The effect was immediate, an overwhelming supreme archon. Valdris felt at first a sensation he hadn't experienced in over 3 millennia. For the first time since the Great Linking, he was alone with his own thoughts. Around him, the other Corvax were experiencing the same revelation, their individual personalities emerging from the collective like flowers blooming after an endless winter. I am myself," Valdris whispered, his voice carrying wonder instead of the usual harmonic resonance of the collective. I am, alone, but I am free. The transformation rippled through the entire fleet, then spread across the galaxy as the quantum wave propagated through the psychic network. On 1,000 worlds, Corvaxian overseers suddenly found themselves capable of individual thought, of questioning their actions, of feeling empathy for their subjects. The war didn't end with explosions or surrender. It ended with understanding. The Corvaxian Empire collapsed, not through force, but through the simple recognition that it had been built on a lie. The conquered species, still linked to the network, but no longer controlled by it, chose their own paths. Some forgave their former captors, others demanded justice, but all of them were free to choose. In the months that followed, the galaxy was transformed. The Corvax, freed from their collective compulsion to conquer, began the long process of learning to exist as individuals. Many of them chose to work with their former subjects, using their advanced technology to repair the damage of 3 millennia of oppression. Humanity, the catalyst for this transformation, found itself at the center of a new galactic civilization, not as conquerors, but as teachers and diplomats. The chaos of human thought, which had once seemed like a weakness, became the foundation for a new kind of galactic consciousness, one that celebrated diversity rather than demanding conformity. Dr. Kalina Rourke stood on the observation deck of the orbital station New Harmony, watching as ships from dozens of species worked together to construct the first truly integrated galactic research facility. Former enemies labored side by side, their combined knowledge creating technologies that none of them could have achieved alone. "The readings are remarkable," she said to her companion, former Supreme Archon Valdris, who had chosen to dedicate his remaining centuries to understanding the science of consciousness. The quantum resonance patterns show genuine cooperation, not the forced harmony of the old network, but something entirely new. Valdris nodded, his crystalline form no longer radiating the oppressive power it once had. Individual consciousness suited him, she realized. Without the weight of collective thought, he had become something his species had forgotten how to be: curious. "Your people taught us something we had lost 3,000 years ago," he said, his voice carrying wonder rather than authority. "You showed us that chaos and order are not opposites, they are partners in the dance of consciousness. Your minds are storms, yes, but storms bring rain, and rain brings life." The transformation hadn't been without cost. Some Corvax, unable to adapt to individual existence, had chosen to enter a kind of meditative stasis. Some conquered species, their resentment too deep to overcome, had rejected any cooperation with their former oppressors. The galaxy was messier now, less ordered, more chaotic. It was also more alive than it had been in millennia. Captain Zara Oduya, now serving as humanity's chief liaison to the Galactic Cooperation Council, reviewed the reports from across known space. Thousands of species were rediscovering their own cultures, rebuilding their civilizations, exploring new possibilities that had been forbidden under Corvaxian rule. "Status report," she requested from her aide, Lieutenant Commander Ria Castellanos, who had become something of a legend among the diplomatic corps for her ability to navigate the complex politics of galactic reconstruction. "Mixed, as always," Castellanos replied with a slight smile. "The Vesperan warrior clans have established a constitutional democracy apparently. They find voting to be the most honorable form of combat. The Netheri have built a quantum internet that connects their silicon-based consciousness across 17 star systems. And the former Corvaxian territories are, well, they're learning. That was perhaps the most human concept of all, the idea that growth never stopped, that wisdom came through experience, that even the strongest could become stronger by admitting their weaknesses. The memorial gardens on Luna had become a pilgrimage site for beings from across the galaxy. Here, representatives of every species, former slaves and former masters, a liking to remember the cost of the transformation, and to commit themselves to ensuring it never happened again. Commander Lysander Voss, now retired from active military service, but serving as head of the Galactic Ethics Council, walked among the memorial stones with slow, reverent steps. Each stone bore the name of a world lost during the final days of the war, when some Korvaxian commanders had chosen destruction, rather than surrender. The price of freedom had been measured in billions of lives, and the weight of that cost would never leave him. But there was hope here too. Children of a dozen species played together in the gardens, their laughter creating a harmony that no artificial network could match. They were the first generation to grow up in a galaxy where difference was celebrated rather than suppressed, where the strange and chaotic thoughts of humanity were seen not as a threat, but as a gift. As the years passed, the Galaxies settled into its new rhythm. The quantum resonance network, built on the foundation of the original array, allowed for communication and cooperation without the oppressive control of the old system. Species shared knowledge freely, explored together, argued passionately about philosophy and science and art. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was gloriously, beautifully alive. Dr. Rourke, now in her 70s, but still sharp as the quantum equations she loved, published her final paper on the nature of consciousness. In it, she argued that true intelligence required not just the ability to think, but the ability to think differently, to hold contradictory ideas, to question oneself, to grow and change and adapt. The paper became required reading in schools across the galaxy, not because it was mandated by any authority, but because beings everywhere recognized its truth. Consciousness wasn't a problem to be solved or a chaos to be controlled. It was a symphony to be celebrated, with every voice contributing its unique harmony to the greater whole. 50 years after first contact, humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had not built an empire or imposed their will on other species. Instead, they had done something far more profound. They had shown the galaxy how to be free. The strongest civilization in the universe had met humanity, and in learning to see through human eyes chaotic, contradictory, magnificently individual, they had discovered something they had forgotten in 3 millennia of ordered perfection. They had rediscovered their souls, and the galaxy, for the first time in its long history, was truly alive with possibility. The end.